Ever thought of the worst way to die? Well, these people didn't have the luxury of just thinking. They ended up with a pretty terrible fate. In this video, we're going to look at the worst deaths in every time periods. The prehistoric era. Scalping in the Stone Age. If you were alive back in the prehistoric era, the mammoths or extinct animals they had back then would have been the least of your problems, which is amongst many problems because I can imagine just staying alive and fighting the elements was one of them. There was the horrifying act called scalping. This was one of the earliest forms of death, apart from being smashed by dinosaurs. These people weren't just hunting and being hunted. They were also cutting off each other's scalps. Turns out Stone Age folks weren't all about bashing heads with rocks and tree branches. They had a pretty fine skill with knives or whatever knives looked like then. The makeshift blade would dig into the skin, cutting through muscle and hair. Think about skill. Blood would start trickling down quickly as the scalp was slowly ripped off, leaving the skull exposed. Fun fact, the scalp has a very rich supply of blood, so that would definitely be a lot of blood loss. Scalping wasn't always a quick death. In many cases, the victim would still be alive during the whole process, feeling every bit of the excruciating pain as their scalp was peeled away. Surviving that kind of injury was almost impossible, as it left an open wound, raw flesh exposed to dirt and infection, which were almost certain to follow. Since penicillin would be invented millennia later, an excruciating death was inevitable. One of the most famous ancient events of scalping was from the Scythians, a set of nomadic people that Herodotus described in horrifying detail. These warriors didn't just kill their enemies, they also scalped them. Then treated their flesh like leather to hang as a reward on their horses. It was like the ultimate status symbol. The more scalps you had, the bigger your bragging rights. The Stone Age tools like the obsidian and flint knives were perfect for this job. But once the metal knives came into play, scalping became much easier. Not the kind of upgrade anyone wishes for, especially if you stole someone's game. The ancient times, Brazen bull. The brazen bull was ancient Greece's twisted version of a barbecue. Being roasted alive in a giant metal bowl doesn't sound fun. This was a real execution device, designed by a guy named Pericles for the tyrant Phalaris of Sicily. Pericles thought he'd score some major points with this invention, which, in my opinion, I think he deserved for his brilliant invention. But he definitely was in for a big surprise. The bowl was made of bronze. You probably were taught in elementary school. This material is an excellent conductor of heat. The bowl was also hollow on the inside and large enough to trap a person in. Once they put a victim inside, a fire was lit underneath the bowl, slowly roasting them alive, making this a claustrophobic hell. To make things even more horrifying, the bowl was designed with a smart system of tubes that turned the victim's screams into something that sounded like a bull. So imagine having a panic attack in a hot metallic room, screaming in pain while your tormentor is dancing to the sound of your torment because it sounds, melodic and brilliant. These deaths weren't quick deaths. The victims were pretty much alive and in pain. It was a slow, suffocating heat that entered their skin and cooked the body from the outside in. Breathing automatically became harder and harder as their lungs were filled with heat. Guess who became the first victim of the brilliant and beautiful hell of a contraption? I'll even help out. We have A, cunning thief, B, serial killer, C, his beloved brilliant inventor, or D, the city's most wanted criminal that was caught the week ago. If you guessed anything other than C, you were wrong. The inventor Pericles didn't quite get the reward he was expecting. After showing off his invention, Phalaris tricked him into testing it out on himself. Once he stepped inside, the door slammed shut and the fire was lit. Phalaris wanted to hear just how melodious those screams would sound. Well, Pericles barely survived being roasted inside his own creation, but his luck ran out when he was tossed off a cliff by Phalaris. Ironically, his invention ended up being his downfall. Also, in the ancient times, there was the crucifixion. While a lot of you humans must have heard about this form of death, you probably think it's simply that someone gets tied or nailed to a giant wooden cross and is left hanging until they, die. Well, that's why you have me. Not to be crucified though, just explain. The crucifixion was basically a brutal form of capital punishment back in ancient times. This lovely little practice was all the rage of the Persians, Carthaginians, and of course the Romans. The crucifixion of Jesus Christ is the most famous and brutal of cases, and has become a key part of Christianity. Crucifixion was a ritual of pain and humiliation meant to strip away every ounce of dignity before death. So basically, Jesus was stripped naked and paraded around the community, contrary to what has been portrayed in stories for modesty reasons. Before he was taken to the cross, he was brutally beaten with a whip by multiple Roman soldiers called flagrum, containing pieces of bones and metals attached to it. So basically, each lash tore into the skin, taking chunks of skin with it, leaving deep, open wounds. To the non-Bible folks, take a wild guess how many of the lashes he was given. About 39 flesh-eating lashes. He was also given a crown of torn hair, with each torn hair digging deep into his scalp. Remember what I taught you on the scalp earlier? Scalp equals a lot of blood vessels. Injury to the scalp equals loss of lots of blood. Ouches. He was then forced to cross, weighing about 125 pounds across a distance of about 1 kilometer, after losing a significant amount of flesh, blood, and strength. When Jesus was finally nailed to the cross, the nails were thick and about 5 to 7 inches long. These iron spikes were driven through the wrists, not the palms, because, well, logically speaking, your palms can't actually hold your weight. Well, if you've ever glanced at your human wrist, you find long cords called tendons and some veins. Well, nerves and arteries are also present, so each hammer to the nail is pure pain and torture. His feet were also nailed together, then to the beam. All these put together made every move and breath excruciating. About the cause of death, well, that's still up for debate. Some scholars think asphyxiation was the main cause. With all that weight hanging on your arms, breathing would become a real struggle. Others suggest heart failure or dehydration could do the trick too. And if you're wondering what he did to deserve this gruesome death, it was basically for calling himself King of the Jews. The medieval era, rats torture. In medieval times, it was a time when knights, castles, and the occasional dragon ruled the land. And rats rule the underworld. Dungeons. One of the events comes from the Tower of London. It talked about a rat dungeon, where prisoners would be locked in a dark, dank cell below the high water mark of the Thames. And when there was a tide, it brought in a whole load of hungry rats. So the prisoner is trapped in this dark hole, listening to the sound of squeaking as those little rodents move around, probably eyeing their limbs like a dish. Turns out these rats, out of sheer hunger and exhaustion from their trip, took little bits and pieces from prisoners' skin till they were knocking their teeth against bones. During the Dutch Revolt, Diederik Sonner thought it'd be a great idea to put a bowl of rats upside down on a naked prisoner's belly. He put hot coals in the bowl, forcing the rats to eat their way out. As the heat intensifies, it is only normal for the rats to try to escape the heat. They start digging into the only escape route they had, which was the prisoner's body. Their sharp claws and teeth tore through the skin, eating their way through the muscles trying to survive. After a considerable amount of damage to delicate organs, it's a no-brainer that the victim ends up with a horrifying and painful death. Another horrifying death in the medieval times was boiling. Ishikawa Goemon, a famous icon in medieval times, was sadly a victim of this gruesome death. His life has inspired a lot of movies, cartoons, and even video games because he is known to be the Japanese Robin Hood. But his death was not exactly a fairy tale. It was more like a tragedy. Hideyoshi, a brutal lord, wanted to punish Ishikawa so badly that he put him and his family in a big pot of boiling water. Come to think about it, what worse way is it to die than watching your family also die? Not just by gunshot or arrow to the heart, but by boiling and hearing their screams alongside yours. For what offense? Playing hero and having a pretty face. Yeah, sad. When Ishikawa saw his little son being uncomfortable from the slowly rising heat, he tried to hold his son up high to keep him away from the boiling water. As he was being boiled alive, the heat became unbearable, like being in a hot bath times a million. He felt his skin bubbling and peeling away from his body. The steam was suffocating, and the pain was excruciating. His hands could barely hold up his son. He could feel the flesh on his back melting while the scorching water burned every inch of him. He tried to survive, or at least hold out to save his child, but in the end, his hands gave out. so he decided to give a child a quick death by strangling him. They both passed away in the boiling cauldron. Apparently, it turns out your brain can't come up with an escape plan when you are neck deep and holding a toddler above your head in boiling water. Early modern period, execution by drawing and quartering. So we've entered the early modern period, but don't let the name fool you. Even with modern ideas, gruesome death was still very much a thing, and it got a serious upgrade in the brutality department. The unfortunate star of the show was Robert-François Damiens. This guy tried to assassinate King Louis XV on March 28, 1757, which, spoiler alert, did not end well for him. When they dragged him from his cell, he famously quipped, "La journée sera rude," which is translated to, "the day will be hard." I mean, at that point, he might as well have added, "hold my beer," because things were about to get real hard. First on the torture menu were the boots, which were less about style and more about crushing his legs. Just to spice things up, they used red-hot pincers to give him a little hot hands treatment. They also poured sulfur in the hand he used to wield the knife. The royal executioner, Charles Henry Sanson, included emasculation in the torture. Pretty words for cutting a man's genitalia. He tied poor bloody Damiens to a team of horses after he had cut his tendons so the horses could do their part in the punishment. Surprisingly, he survived that, and they thought what more could be done? So they burned his torso while the crowd cheered. His last words are still kind of a speculation. Some said he wailed, "O death, why art thou so long in coming?" While others suggested he would have been too busy begging for mercy to even say anything reasonable. After his dramatic exit, his remains were turned to ashes and scattered like confetti. His house was pretty much messed up, and his family had to change their names and go into hiding. I mean, I would too if I were human and was born in that era. Modern period. One of the horrifying deaths of the modern period was the murder of Junko Furuta. Trigger warning. This story includes disturbing events of abduction, torture, and murder. On November 25, 1988, a girl named Junko Furuta was riding her bike home when Hiroshi Miyano targeted her. He pretended to be her hero, faked an attack, and then rescued her, leading her into a nightmare that lasted 42 days. After kidnapping her, Hiroshi took her to a hotel and raped her. He then brought her to a house in Adachi, Tokyo, where things got even worse. Along with his friends, Yo Ogura, Shinji Minato, and Yasushi Watanabe, they tortured her in the most horrible ways. They made her call her parents to say she had run away while they kept her trapped. The group didn't just gang rape her. They went to extreme. They shaved her pubic hair, set her genitals on fire, and beat her badly when she tried to escape. They forced her to dance naked while humiliating her and shoved bottles and metal rods inside her. As if that wasn't enough, they made her drink alcohol, smoke 2 cigarettes at once, and breathe in pain fumes. They acted like devils, enjoying every moment of her suffering. By late December, Junko was barely alive, starving, and weak. On January 4th, 1989, after another night of abuse, Hiroshi poured liquor fluid on her and set her on fire. She fought to survive, but after 2 hours of unbearable pain, she passed away. When they found out that she was dead, they wrapped her body in a blanket, stuffed it into a travel bag, and sealed it in a metal drum with concrete. They dumped it in a deserted lot on Wakasu Island, thinking they could hide what they did. When they were finally caught, Hiroshi got 20 years in prison, while others received lighter sentences. Well, that was a rather rough ride down Grim Reaper's lane. If you have braved our previous video, the most evil human experiment in history, you're the real MVP. Until next time, stay safe, humans.